I met in Bnei Akiva. My children went to Bnei Akiva here in Israel. And somebody might notice that my son works for Bnei Akiva, and he's here in this group also. And so it's truly an honor to be able to speak to you at this point with a digital or a remote Zikaron BaSalon. And I'm going to speak about my parents. Now, my parents, Ida and David Nabozny, Zichronam Livracha, we'll talk about details about their lives. We'll talk about their experience during the Holocaust. And you'll notice that I wrote here on the slide, second-class survivors. And I'm going to talk about that term toward the end, but I would explain that my parents felt at some point in their lives that they were considered second-class survivors. And I'll try to explain to you why as we go on. If there are questions as we're going forward, please let me know. Now, just a little bit about the agenda for our talk. First of all, I think I need to set the stage and give you some general background about the German invasion of Poland. It's really important to understand what happened, who was there, when they were there, and why, of course. And then with that, we can go into more detail about my mother's history, then my father's history, and then we'll talk about my parents together, where they met, how they met, and then we'll come around to this concept of second-class survivor. So if you'll allow me, we'll go forward. Oh, this works, the arrow key works. Okay. Germany invades Poland. The 1st of September, 1939. Now, there's a lot to discuss before this to understand to this invasion. But if we spend that time here, we'll never get around to the topic we want to talk about. And besides, I'll invite you to come to Yad Vashem and we can discuss it there. Germany invades Poland from the west. Germany, the country, is positioned west of Poland. Germany makes an agreement with the Soviet Union in the background, a hidden agreement. It's called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, so that when Germany invades Poland, Soviet Union won't object. They are sitting to the east. And about 2 weeks after the German invasion, Union also invades from the east, and Poland is overrun in approximately a month. So again, just a little bit of background, because it's important to understand this if we're talking about my parents' experiences. And you can see on this slide, if you look on this slide, can you see my mouse, everybody? Moving around? Yes, okay. So here is Germany. Here is the Soviet Union, and here in this map is Poland. And Poland is divided into 3 parts. A part that is annexed by Germany and made part of Germany. A part that is annexed by the Soviet Union, made part of the Soviet Union. Remember, they both invaded from different sides. And there's a section in the center called the general government. The general government is actually controlled completely by Germany, just not made part of Germany. Now, what I have highlighted in red are the locations that we're going to begin to talk about. The first location, where my mom is from, Ida. Ida is from a town, a village, a shtetl, let's say, called Krasnoshelsk. It's right here at the tip of Poland, just north of Warsaw, just under what is part of Germany here. So when the Germans invade, they get there rapidly. My father, on the other hand, is from way eastern side of Poland, very close to the Soviet Union, to the Ukraine. In fact, this area today is part of the Ukraine. If you want to go to Sarny, you have to go to the Ukraine and come across. And it is overrun much later. And we'll get to that because Germany subsequently invades the Soviet Union. I'd like to start my mom's experience. Let's keep it on this. Try to keep it on the screen. Okay. My mom, her maiden name was Bergazin. As I said, she was from a Polish town called Krasnoshelsk. It's a shtetl. It's a classic shtetl. 3,000 population, about 60% Jewish in 1939. The history goes back even further. The first synagogue was built there in 1883. They had Jews in this village, in this shtetl, already from the 1700s. My mother's family, 5 individuals. My mother herself, her father Shimshon, the spelling is how it was spelled in the Polish time. Her mother Doba, her brother Jack, and her sister Ruthie. My mother was the sandwich child. She was right in the middle. Jack's mother is sent out to a field in order to take the cow because the cow has to eat. And the bombings begin there also. She's separated from her family there. They can't find her. My mother never spoke much at all about her experiences. I should have told you this right at the beginning. Most of the information I have from my Uncle Jack, who did speak a bit and recorded some information. She's separated from her family. She's out in this field. Actually, a local in that area takes her out of the field into protection, which is why she can't find her way back. And in fact, Uncle Jack told me that they hadn't found her for hours, and my grandfather began to sit shiva for her because he thought that she was killed in the bombing. Once again, Rajmin is occupied and they're forced to return. So you can see the distances here. They're practically 90 kilometers they've gone. This is all by foot at this point, and return to Krasnoshels. The third step and their third escape, this one actually successful and not actually an escape, because this is early in the war. You're talking about late September now. The Germans decide to make the region around Krasnoshels Judenrein. Judenrein means cleared of Jews. The Jews there are forced to sign documentation to say that they're voluntarily relinquishing their property, and then they're forced out of town, given a few hours to pack a bag per individual, and then driven out. Now, I wrote driven out to the east. However, there may be those who didn't go to the east, but I know my family went to the east. And the reason they were driven out to the east is because if you remember the map, east of this area was under Soviet control, not German control. The Bergazin family crosses over to that Soviet occupied area and ends up in Bialystok. Now, I don't know if you see this. My screen is blocked a little. I'm going to move something out of the way. But you can see here that it's now approximately 150 kilometers away. When they arrive in Bialystok, the Russians are not so happy. The Soviets are not so happy to receive them. In fact, I understand that the Soviets told the Jews, the Jewish refugees who were arriving there, go back to your part of Poland. It's okay. It'll be good for you there. It's just new leadership, the Germans. It'll be fine. And there were those who did go back. But my grandfather, Shimshon, decided it is not safe to go back, and they're placed in a refugee camp in Bialystok. Now, interestingly, I know a lot about my family's escape. What I don't know a lot about is their experience later in Soviet labor camps, other than where they were. So here, with a map and with a list, I can show you what labor camps they were sent to. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. Number one, in 1939, my mother is 8 years old. Okay, Jack is older. He's 10, almost 11 years by then. They're deported, if you look from where Bialystok is, to a labor camp that's, this whole path, by the way, is 4,000 kilometers. It's not actually valid, but it's about 2,000 kilometers away. Obviously, they're sent by train. Obviously, there's hardship. Obviously, there's starvation, right? Obviously, there's bitter cold in this camp. And the first camp they come to, they spend about June to October 41, 15 months, and then move down here to a second camp where they spend 2.5 years. 2.5 years in hard labor. Now, my grandmother, Doba, actually dies in December of 1940 in this first camp here. So my mother, now 10 years old, becomes the woman of the house. Her brother Jack and her father Shimshon are sent out to labor. She cares for her younger sister Ruthie. She's actually the woman of the house. Later, toward the end of the war, May 1944, by May 1944, Germany is clearly losing the war. They're sent south, back south to Kharkov, this area, where they're sent to another labor camp. And they're in this camp until May 46, because now the war has ended in May of 1945. Only then they're able to try to make their way back to Poland and then onward. Hang on. Let me pressed the wrong button here. You'll have to forgive me. So this is the route they take from the last labor camp they were in, Shebekino, which is another nearly 2,000 kilometers. They come back into a town called Klotzken, which is Glatz in German. There's a refugee center there. They don't spend very much time there. They're clearly unwelcome there. And they continue onward, this is the location here, to a camp, a displaced persons camp, DP camp in Austria under the US zone in Austria. So the US is running these DP camps, and they end up in two camps. They're one right nearby the other, one for a short period of time, and then they're obviously assigned to this camp where they spend a much longer period of time. Now you see 1947 to 1950 in this area down here. Well, at this point in time in 1947, Ida, my mom, is now 16 years old. A young woman or an older teenager, I'm not sure where you all were when you were 16, but she makes a crucial decision. My family, my mother's family, already had aunts, uncles in the United States, and they obtained papers in order to immigrate to the United States. So my Uncle Jack, Ruthie, and my grandfather all immigrated to the United States. They ended up settling in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where they had family there. However, my mother separates from the family in 1947 at the age of 16 and makes the decision to go to Israel, to go to what was the British mandate in Palestine. She becomes active with the Zionist youth in the DP camps, and a group of 273 young people, 273 are transferred to northern Italy to what is like a training camp to come to Israel. My father called it a kibbutz. My mother, I don't remember if she used that name, but they're in this training camp. They're learning Hebrew. They're learning agriculture in order to immigrate to Israel. By the way, the photos you see here at the top, I don't know if anybody can pick out my mother in this picture. This is my mom right here. Okay. Here, they're going to board an illegal immigrant ship on the 14th of January, 1948. They're transferred southward. They're transferred to Venice. The ship is docked about 20 kilometers outside of Venice. They're taken on rafts or on small boats out to the ship. The ship is called the Lamed Hay. Lamed Hay, Heroes of Gush Etzion in English. Giborei Gush Etzion. Anybody remember the story of the Lamed Hay? In January of 1948, 35 Israeli soldiers made an effort to go from Jerusalem to Gush Etzion to reinforce the soldiers there in Gush Etzion. They were found. They were all murdered en route. And the ship was named after them, the Lamed Hay. The ship sails on January 17th. They have bad weather. They have engine trouble. They have to dock in Italy, but they do make it across. And about 75 kilometers from the shores of Israel, they're spotted by the British, a plane flying overhead, a destroyer appears nearby. It demands that they sail to Cyprus because the British had established camps in Cyprus for refugees, so they would not come into Israel. The ship refuses. It continues sailing about 50 kilometers from Haifa. It's boarded by British sailors. They overtake the ship, and it's towed into the port in Haifa. The photo you see here is the Lamed Hay. It's being tied to a British ship. These immigrants, I don't know, it's possible my mother is in this picture. I have no idea. It's not clear enough to see, are transferred to the British ship. They never set foot on Israeli soil, and they're shipped off to Cyprus, but it's already 1948. Their time in Cyprus is short because sometime in the spring of 48, my mother comes to Israel. And I know this because my mother told us that she was there for the Declaration of Independence, the 14th of May, and she was part of the celebrations that took place in Tel Aviv. So here's my mother in Israel in 1948. I want to move over and begin to speak about my father. I don't know if there's anybody who wants to ask a question. I'll pause. My father was born on the 18th of September.
David.
Yes,
Hi, so my name is Connie. First of all, thank you.
you're welcome.
I'm wondering, was it common for the families to be kept together when they were sent to Siberia or any of those slave labor camps?
Well, so it's a really good question, and you'll be interested to know that in my father's case, the family separated. So I think it
Um,
was not. I don't think there was one way or the other. It depended how they decided to flee. If they fled
uh-huh.
together, they were able to stay together, I suppose, like my mother's family was able to. My father's case, when we get to it, you'll see he did not flee with the rest of his family, and it was devastating for the family.
Okay. Yeah, because I feel like when a family is able to stay together, there's a certain amount of safety and security, even though they're under terrible conditions and all of the everything that you mentioned and more. But there's some sort of ability, I think, to retain hope when there's a family unit around you. You
And
know.
it's interesting that you bring this up, and it's interesting for two reasons. Because it's how did families survive or not? And the other reason is just something today. My son Matan sent me a video today of somebody speaking about heroism during the Holocaust. And when Jews came to Israel after the Holocaust, we're off on a tangent. I apologize for a minute. So if those of you listening in, please forgive me. We're off on a Jews came into to Palestine, to Israel after the Holocaust. The locals who were there, who were fighters, who had been there for years, didn't understand how they didn't fight back. Now they did fight back, and there were certain instances like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising where they fought back, etc. And the person speaking said, "You don't understand. A father who could have escaped and fought with the partisans and gotten away, his heroism was the understanding that he had to remain with his family. That by remaining with his family, he was giving them hope. He was giving them confidence. He was caring for them. He was heroic just by staying with the family." So it's an interesting perspective. Okay, I'm going to move on to my father, Aryeh, born in 1920 to the 18th of September. He was born in a bigger place. It was a town, not just a city. The population was about 12,000 in 1941. Now, you notice I say 1941 because that was when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. June 22nd, 1921, they invade the Soviet Union. If you think about the map we saw, the side that was orange, they crossed from the green side into the orange side, invade deeply into the Soviet Union. About 50% of the town was Jewish. My father's family, a bit larger. His father Dov, his mother Itka, a brother Shlomo who was 2 years older, and two younger sisters, Shoshana and Malka. They had a small business, a dry goods store, something along that line. Now, my father, this was a very Zionist family. My father's family were so Zionistic that my father went to a school that was called the Tarbut School. The Tarbut School was a school that taught in Hebrew. Everything was, my father spoke about it and said, even the children who were in school during the recess, during the breaks, they would speak Hebrew to one another. My father spoke perfect Hebrew, better than mine. So he was educated in Tarput school. The pictures you see here, my father as a young man, his parents, and a family photo. This is my father's brother Shlomo, my father Aryeh, the two sisters Shoshana and Malka, and grandparents. I have to look at the back of the picture to see whose parents these were. I think they were my grandfather's parents, my great-grandparents, grandparents on that side. Now, we're going to talk about escape again. It's going to be a common theme here in what we discuss. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. We spoke about that. Once they invaded, the locals believed, the Jews believed, that women, children, elderly would be safe, and the young men fled immediately. They fled immediately. Sarnia is occupied by the Germans on the 6th of July, 1941, only a couple of weeks after the invasion. They make the decision, his father, Dov, my father, Aryeh, to flee eastward, step deeper into the Soviet Union. The interesting thing is his brother Shlomo was already drafted into the Polish army. And if you look at the distance here, they travel over 600 kilometers to a Russian town called Smolensk, where my grandfather had a brother. However, when they arrived there, his brother has already been drafted into the Soviet army. His wife receives them very warmly, but they can't spend much time there because the Germans are mercilessly bombing Smolensk. They want to get out of there, but because of the bombing, it's hard for them to escape. They're there, my father said, about a week or two before they continue further. And before I go on to the next step of their trip, they had escaped. Now, we talked about my mother and her entire family escaping. On the other hand, my father's sister's mother, etc., remained in Sarny. Sarny is now being treated like many other towns that have already been in Poland. A ghetto was established rapidly in April of 1942. Thousands of Jews are forced into the ghetto. By the way, this photo of Sarny is not the ghetto. It's a photo I found from the 1920s. Thousands of Jews from Sarny, Sarny and the surrounding villages and towns are forced into this ghetto. As in most ghettos, disease, starvation, the crowded conditions, the unsanitary conditions are all there. And the ghetto doesn't last very long because on the 27th and 28th of August, the ghetto is liquidated and the Jews are rounded up and held in an area that's by the train yard. It's a fenced-in area there. Over 2 days, these Jews are taken out of here to the ravines outside in a forest nearby, and they're shot to death by the Einsatzgruppen, these mobile killing squads from Germany. However, we talk about resistance, they fight back, and there's a revolt once it's understood what's happening. About 2,500 managed to escape to the ghetto, out to the forest. They want to join the partisans who are going to fight the Germans, but they're hunted by the Germans. It's only known that about 500 to 1,000 survive. So the question asked is, what about my father's family at the time? They're forced into the ghetto like everybody else. However, my grandmother, apparently very ingenious woman, she finds a hole in the fence of the ghetto and she pushes or forces his two sisters, Malka and Shoshana, to get out of the ghetto, get out through this opening, and she tells them who to go to, a friend, a non-Jewish friend, where she hopes that they'll be able to find refuge. They'll be protected. As they're walking through town, they're spotted by someone who was their neighbor who recognizes them and informs on them to the German police that are there, or the soldiers, and they are shot in the street by the Germans. The rest of the family, the grandparents, Itket, etc., were sent to the pits, sent to the murder site from the ghetto. Come back to my father's story. They realize they have to get out of Smolensk. It takes about a week or two until they can finally escape. And they make their way to a place called Jambal in Kazakhstan. Now, if you look at the map here, from Smolensk to this location, it's almost 4,000 kilometers. Now, obviously, they're not walking. There are trains that they get onto, other routes in which they come. When they get to Jambal, the local men are drafted to the Russian army, to the Soviet army, to be more accurate. There are women and children there. There's terrible starvation. There are many refugees there. Now, my father, this is where Shlomo joins my father. He actually joins my father and my grandfather together. My father did not know how Shlomo found out where they were. It's something that's a question to the family, but he manages to flee the Polish army and join them there. Now, the conditions there were very, very difficult. My father is sent to work in a factory. It's a factory that makes bricks. And he talks about the fact that they had these big vats where they would put teat in, which is the material they make bricks from, and water. And the men there were forced in these big vats to stand in there. You know, and everybody's seen the images of people stomping on grapes. Well, here they had to stand in there walking around in order to mix this material so that bricks can be made out of it. Nearby to this factory, there was a sugar factory. The sugar factory had sacks that they used for sugar. The sacks were quality fabric, and they were useful for people to use either to make clothing or for other purposes. My grandfather Dov managed to obtain a few of these sacks. He hid them in their room. My father said under his pillow. Their room is raided and these sacks are found, and my grandfather is arrested. He's taken to prison, and there he dies in prison. The younger refugees that are there, my father, my uncle, are rounded up for further deportation. Now, my father talked about this area in Kazakhstan. It was warm there. It was the eastern area. And now they're being deported to Siberia. They're slave laborers. And again, if you look here at the map, the great distances they were forced to travel, they were transported by train for over a month. They could feel the weather growing colder. They were starving. My father tells the story as the train would stop briefly for them to get off, and they would see people there who were trying to sell food, and they were so hungry they would grab food just to try to survive. They arrive at a labor camp deep in a forest. They actually are taken off the large train. They're put on these little trains on these narrow tracks. They have to crawl inside the cars in order to be taken out to this forest area. And there, they're taught how to cut trees down. They're forced labor with a saw, as you see in the image here, where it's a two-man job, and they're forced to cut trees down. They live on a piece of bread a day and some watery soup that they receive. He talks about the fact that men there were dying of starvation and exposure under these conditions. My father, my uncle, Shlomo, and another young man that they befriend there, my father remembered his name is Anshul, they plot to escape this camp. They know that if they remain there, they will not survive. So they talk, there's a local village nearby. They manage to engage with the locals, my father speaks about. And in engaging with the locals, they want to try to find out where the train tracks pass, where there might be a station, without letting on what the reason for that is. Once they kind of get a general direction of where to go, where the train tracks are, one night they make the decision to escape, and they have to escape through the forest, through the cold, bitter cold and snow. They walk for hours, and they arrive at the station. Their problem was that when they came out of the forest into the clearing by the station, they were too close to the station. There are guards at the station. The guards catch them. They're obviously interrogated, but ultimately they're sent back to this labor camp. They don't give up. They make the decision to escape yet again. After a period of time, it's unclear, I think a few months, Aryeh, Shlomo, and Anshul escape again. And this time, with the knowledge of what they gained from the previous escape, they come to the train tracks, but they stand further away from the station, not to be seen by the guards. However, they realize that they have to be close enough to be able to jump a train, because once it picks up speed, they won't be able to do so. From afar, they hear a train arriving. It stops at the station. It's a freight train to unload materials, the freight. And then it sets out further. By the way, in the map again, you can see where they are. They're over here, right? And they continue now. They're going westward. My father talks about being on the train for a few hours. The train leaves the station. They go running after the train. The last car of the train, like the caboose, has a ladder which leads up to the roof. And one by one, they grab the ladder, climb to the top of the train, and they lay on the roof of the train, and they lay side by side because it's freezing temperature in order to try to keep warm. You think about it. I think my grandson once said it's like watching an action movie, right? They're on the top of the train for hours until they arrive in a town. They figure that they need to get to the nearest city. At the nearest city, before the train stops in the station, they'll climb off the train, jump off the train, and then they'll go into town and see if they can find protection. However, the plan is a good plan. They do so, but they're spotted as outsiders. My father says they're arrested by 2 policemen, and they're taken to the police station to be interrogated. Now, before they were arrested, they had the foresight, the knowledge to coordinate their stories. So they tell whoever asks them what they're doing there. They're arrested by the police. The story that they have is that they are Polish men who are seeking to join the Polish army. There's a Polish army in exile who's going to fight the Germans. They want to fight the Germans there. They're put in a large room, it turns out, in separate corners so they can't communicate. And one by one, they're taken in for interrogation. My father's taken in for interrogation. Officer sitting behind a desk. There's a pistol on the desk. He says, ask my father these questions. My father tells the story that they coordinated. Polish wants to join the Polish army. He has no papers. He has no identification. The officer tells my father, stand up, drop your pants. He wants to find out if my father is Jewish or not and challenges him. He says to him, you're not Polish. My father is silent. He picks up his pistol. My father says this. He points it at him and he says, I'll kill you like a dog. My father said that at this point, they had nothing. Being threatened with death meant nothing to them anymore. However, they were lucky. The men were at war. The city needed laborers, and they were sent and released to go to another labor camp. My father is sent to work in a factory. He and his brother Shlomo, I don't know what happened to Anshul, we don't know what happened to, are sent to work in a nearby village to a factory. My father didn't remember what the factory did. He remembers being constantly hungry. The factory is located in a forest. In order to get there, as you see in the photo, there was a large open snow-covered field. My father would talk about how they would just be freezing walking over to get to the factory. My father was a good worker. He received a more responsible position in the factory. He was given responsible for a storage room that was used to store the tools that they used in the factory at night, etc. And he had the keys to the storage room. My father befriended another young man there, and I told you, they're hungry, they're starving, they need money to buy food, and they hatched a plan. This friend that he had my father said he had golden hands, he could do anything. So they hatched a plan that during the night, they would cross the field, get to the factory. The factory was guarded. The guard would go back and forth on a patrol route. So they had to time themselves carefully not to get caught, because if they were caught, they would be shot. They would sneak into the factory, go into the supply room, take a small amount of supplies. My father said they would take nails and small sheets of metal. They talked about putting the nails in his pockets, and the metal they could wrap on their body as they fled. And this friend of his was handy, could make buckets from the sheet metal, and they would go to the market in that village and they would sell these buckets in order to buy food, or they would barter for food. My father said they did this a number of times. My father was never proud of this. He told this in an embarrassing way because it was not in his disposition to take an act like this, but they were starving, and in order to survive, they had to take these steps. Escape again. Now this time it is an escape. My father had a good relationship with a factory manager there, a young manager. My father said he was about 35 years old. He said he was Jewish. I think he was married to a non-Jew, a Russian Jew. His name was Guzik. My father owes his life to Guzik. In fact, at my father's funeral, my father instructed me even beforehand that we need to give credit to Guzik for saving his life. Aryeh and Shlomo are at this camp about 6 months when one evening Aryeh is summoned to Guzik's home. Guzik tells him that the police are going to come and arrest him that night. Apparently, somehow they became aware of what's happening. They were going to arrest him, and he must leave immediately or he will be arrested. He tells him, go home, collect the minimal amount of things, and the thing that he does for him is he gives him a train pass. It is a special pass that allows him to travel on the trains without money. It gives him the right to do so. It's intended to allow him to buy materials for the factory. This is what Guzik provides him. And he says to him, get as far away as possible. My father decides that he has to get to Kazakhstan, Remember, he was there. It turns out he knew already that he had other family in Kazakhstan. He talks about not knowing how many. It takes him a very, very long time to get to Kazakhstan. Guzik, by giving him this warning and by giving him this pass, actually saved his life. My father is in Kazakhstan for maybe a few months. The war ends May 1945, and as many of the survivors did, he wants to make his way back home to see what happened to his family. Germany has unconditionally surrendered, and he begins to travel back to Sarny. You can look at the map here. You can see that he's in Kazakhstan, right? He's got to get all the way back to Sarny in Poland, thousands of kilometers. It takes a very, very long time for him to get there. When he arrives in Sarny by train, he departs the train and goes immediately to where his family home is, but the family home is flattened, destroyed. There's nothing there. Nothing remains of Jewish life in Sarny. My father realizes that he cannot stay there. He learns then the story that I told you, the fate of his mother, his sisters, and the family. He stays only one night, and he sets out going further west to Lodz, because Lodz, there was many who had arrived there who were survivors who remained in Lodz, coming back to Lodz. Just as in my mother's case, in my father's case, he speaks Hebrew, he raised in a Zionist family, he joins what he calls a kibbutz to prepare them for Aliyah, a survivor group like this. My father speaks perfect Hebrew. It was rare that any of the survivors spoke Hebrew. Many spoke Yiddish or their local language. They had to learn Hebrew. So he is among the first sent to Israel. He's sent aboard an illegal immigrant ship called the Biriyah. The Biriyah sails in July of 1946. It is way, way overcrowded. Look at the photo here. This is the photo of what the deck of the Biriyah looked like, with 999 passengers aboard trying to get into Israel. Just as in my mother's case, the Biriyah stopped by the British outside of Haifa. The passengers are forced off the ship, but this time they're forced off the ship and they're sent to a detention camp in Israel called Atlit. Today it's a museum for the Mapilim, for the illegal immigration to Israel. My father has family in Israel. It turns out that his mother's brother had already immigrated to Israel in 1929, and because he has family there, they're able to release him to his family. And he goes to his family, and he spends a few months there. He gets a job working in a factory that makes oil. But in 1946, he is drafted into the Haganah, and he remains in the Haganah until after the War of Independence. So just a moment about my parents. My parents meet in 1951 in Tel Aviv. My father, after he was released from the army, with two partners, begins a taxi service. They managed to buy a couple of cars, and they run a taxi service running from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. My mother had a job in the Sochnut, working there. She learned Hebrew very, very quickly. She needs a ride to Jerusalem. My father is the driver. She has the very coveted seat in the front next to him, because these taxis, you sat in the back crowded or in the front seat, and the rest is history. My parents were married on the 26th of March, 1952. Now, I just want to close with this comment, because I said that my parents considered themselves second-class survivors. Let me explain that. To explain that, let's talk about the events of the Holocaust in large terms. We know that about 6 million Jews are murdered during the Holocaust. By the way, 1.5 million of them are children. We know that there were 3.3 million Jews in Poland, the largest Jewish population in Europe, maybe in the world. In my opinion, it's in the world. And we know that 3 million of those were murdered. Only 10% survived. And the interesting thing about the 10% who survived, 2/3 of Polish survivors survived because they fled eastward into the Soviet Union. If you think about the number of Polish Jews who survived in Poland, whether they were in hiding or in the partisans or hidden by righteous among the nations, or survived a series of camps, it is a small number. These 2/3 who survived because they fled, like my family did. And often when I talk to people at Yad Vashem about this, and I talk about people who have Polish family that survived, they say, yes, that was my family too. And yes, that was my family too. Second-class survivors. Well, those who survived in the Soviet Union after the war never received any reparations from the Germans for all of the pain and all of the suffering that they had. They were not considered to be under the German boot, so therefore they weren't entitled. Yet they suffered, as you can see from my parents' experience, they suffered under the circumstances greatly. They considered themselves second-class survivors because they never went through Nazi labor camps or never set foot in a Nazi death camp. They were second-class. That was the attitude they had. Only when they were later in their years, elderly, they received a small amount of money as elder care. So that was this aspect of their consideration of themselves as second-class survivors. I want to finish with a slide here. It's an old photo. Those of you in the family can see that it's an old photo. Two old photos from the same year, because this was the last family photo we have together with my parents the last time they were in Israel, when the family was together, because they were unable to travel later on. And so I'm showing you the family that's grown. My father once said to us that he never believed he would have children, let alone grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And this is our revenge. The fact that we're here in Israel, we're strong, we can protect and defend ourselves, and that we have these glorious families once again in order to take revenge for what the Nazis wanted to do to us. Thank you very, very much. If anybody has a question or comment, I'm happy to entertain it. Everybody's quiet. Either they fell asleep or...
Thank you so much. I am Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. That was just it was such a informative presentation. And my grandfather was also a Siberian prisoner of war from Hungary. So he was only deported he was captured and taken to Siberia in 1944 because he was Hungarian. But he was there, I think, until 1950. He was in Siberia for a long time. Yeah, I think that was common. But even though it was freezing cold and his toenails froze off, I remember, when I was a little kid, I asked him, why don't you have toenails? And he explained to me. He said that for the most part, even though it was intense slave labor, they did feed them. They fed them well. I mean, he was in multiple camps, but yeah. So anyway, so that I never really knew so much about that portion of Siberia, and because most of my grandparents were Hungarian, and this adds a lot of information to help me fill in the gaps of what they went through. So thank you.
So it's interesting that in my mother's case, I know very little about the family experience in Siberia other than where they were, from the information I got from my uncle. In my father's case, he spoke only later in life, by the way, only later in life about his experiences, so we could learn a lot about what happened when he was deported to Siberia and the labor camps that he was in.
Were your parents interviewed by the Steven Spielberg Foundation?
They were not.
They were not. Okay.
They did, though. Yeah. My brother's children did a project about, at least with my father, about his experiences. And in the school that they belonged to, I think the program was called Names Not Numbers, and they interviewed survivors, and he's interviewed them. My father also spoke to my children, and they recorded the conversations that they had with him. And quite some time ago, my father spoke to Matan's junior high school class. So we have a video of that experience also.
Wow, yeah, it's just so important to have these stories documented. And I think a lot of times when the survivors were busy, sort of coming back to life and raising families, it wasn't part of what they necessarily shared. But then when, let's say, the Shoah Foundation and all these different things, they came out and they really wanted to interview the survivors en masse, like the details started to emerge, and I guess maybe it was a safe place, or there was enough distance in terms of time from what they had experienced until, that time that they were interviewed years later. So thank God we have these, we have these testimonies to really learn from and recognize like the strength of character and resilience and just the survival instinct, that is the Jewish nation that lives today. Yeah, that we see in our own soldiers.
I agree. Thank you. And the other thing I would encourage people, if you have, this is a little bit of a promo, if I can. One of the very important things at Yad Vashem is to collect artifacts and materials from families, from survivors, from their family period of time. The sad thing is that there are artifacts that appear in family homes that were brought with family members from Europe, period, either prior to or during the Holocaust, and the generations really don't understand what it is and don't value it. Yad Vashem has a project underway called Gathering the Fragments, that you can bring these to Yad Vashem. They want to know a little bit about the history, and they will be preserved in the archives at Yad Vashem. Interesting elements are on display in the museum and other locations within Yad Vashem. So if anybody does have anything like this and you want to participate, you can get online at Yad Vashem and you can look for this program, Gathering the Fragments.
Wow. It's good to know. Thank you.
Comments, questions? Thank you very much, everybody. It's an honor to have been able to speak to you. It's an honor to speak to Bnei Akiva, especially for me. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David.
You're welcome. Take care, everybody.
By the way, your preparation
careful.
really shows in your presentation. So even though you sort of clipped that you didn't maybe prepare enough, just the details, that you wrote down in every slide and the distances and the maps. I mean, I found that very, very helpful to really make it come alive, so
Thank
just
you.
wanted to note that, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So long, everybody.
Yeah. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
In the Polish time. Her mother, Doba, her brother, Jack, and her sister, Ruthie. My mother was the sandwich child. She was right in the middle. Jack was 2 years older. Ruthie was 3 or 4 years younger. My family, my mother's family, were farm owners. Now, when I say owners, you notice I have it in quotes because Jews weren't allowed to own land at the time. So therefore, they had a relationship, a debt relationship with a local non-Jew, where they actually owned the land, but on record, this non-Jew owned the land. Now, the story of my mother is that they escaped 3 times. Now, on many slides, you'll see a map like I have here. It's not the actual route that they took, but I really put it in to show you distances traveled. You'll see that later slides where the distances become greater and greater. We know Germany invades September 1st, 1939. September 1st is a Friday. Shimshon wisely decides that he has to flee. Remember, Krasnoselts is very close to the border, only 19 kilometers away. The Germans are going to arrive there very quickly. But being a religious family, my grandfather Shimshon decided to delay fleeing Krasnoselts until after Shabbat. However, on Sunday, Germany, in order to soften the ground, begins bombarding that area, including Krasnoselts. And Krasnoselts is occupied on the 4th and 5th of September. Despite this, my mother's family, the Bergazin family, gathers a few belongings, bedding, and a cow, by the way. They fled with a cow and a few possessions, and they begin to move southward to a family friend. As you can see, they travel about 21, 22 kilometers southward to get where they are. to a town called Makov. They have friends in this town. However, the Germans are pursuing them, not directly, but pursuing them also, and will arrive and occupy Makov also. As a result, this is the first time they attempt to escape. The Bergazin family is forced back to Krasnoshels. Now, I'm going to take a sidestep for a moment and talk to you about an event that happens in Krasnoshels when my mother's family is back there on the 5th and 6th of September. On the 5th and 6th of September, 50 to 70 Jewish men are rounded up to repair a bridge just outside of town, over the river outside of town. The Polish army tried to destroy the bridge to slow down the German advance, and they need this bridge repaired so they can continue moving. They take these Jewish men to repair the bridge. My grandfather, Shimshon, is taken away on the first day, has the foresight to hide on the second day and not go out to labor, because at the end of the second day, the men who are working on this bridge, who complete the repair of the bridge, are herded into the synagogue in town, and they are abused and then shot by the German soldiers. The bodies are thrown into a ditch, they're set alight, they're set on fire, and ultimately they're buried in that same location. This is actually very interesting, that it is the first known massacre of Jews under German occupation in Poland. And the other interesting thing about it is that the German military, being a proper military at the time, decides to prosecute the soldiers, the officers who are responsible for this massacre. They're tried in a military court. One of them receives a 9-year sentence at hard labor, the second a 3-year sentence in prison. However, information travels upward through the German hierarchy. Heinrich Himmler, who's responsible for the SS, hears about this, commutes their sentences, and then at that point, they pass laws or regulations that say that any German soldier who might act in protection of themselves against the Jews cannot be accused of a crime. But it's interesting that this was the first event in Poland where a massacre took place. The family, again, under occupation, makes a second attempt to flee. Now, they don't actually make an attempt to flee because the Germans in town, there were Volksdeutsch, which were locals who had a German background. The Germans appoint a mayor who's a Volksdeutsch, who takes responsibility for the town. He comes to the town square and he orders the Jews to come into the town square, and he stands up and speaks to them and says, you know, I've known you for a long time. We've been neighbors for a long time. However, the Germans hate the Jews, and I cannot protect you here. Therefore, he says, you must leave town. I'll make horses and buggies, carriages available to you, which he does not. And the family is forced to flee southward again, and they go toward Warsaw because they believe that Warsaw will be safe. The Polish army says they're going to defend Warsaw vigorously. By the way, after my family comes from the town square back to their home has been ransacked. Every one of their belongings is taken by the locals. They no longer have their belongings. And in fact, when my grandmother, Doba, sees another individual wearing one of her shawls, she goes to try to take it from them. And this is a quote from my Uncle Jack, who wrote, I will never forget the angry look in the neighbor's eyes when she would not relinquish the shawl and said to my mother, it is no longer yours, Jew. So it's interesting that the people they lived alongside with, years, maybe generations, how their attitude was shifted, or maybe not shifted so rapidly. After being in Polshek at my mother's sister, and the family might ask a question, which sister? I think it was Rachel. My grandmother had, not my mother, my grandmother had 3 sisters. I think it was Rachel. She actually had 4 sisters. They are forced to continue south because the Germans are bombing Polsas also. Felt at some point in their lives that they were considered second-class survivors, and I'll try to explain to you why as we go on. If there are questions as we're going forward, please let me know. Now, just a little bit about the agenda for our talk. First of all, I think I need to set the stage and give you some general background about the German invasion of Poland. It's really important to understand what happened, who was there, when they were there, and why, of course. And then with that, we can go into more detail about my mother's history, then my father's history, and then we'll talk about my parents together, where they met, how they met, and then we'll come around to this concept of second-class survivor. So if you'll allow me, we'll go forward. Oh, this works, the arrow key works. Okay. Germany invades Poland. The 1st of September, 1939. Now, there's a lot to discuss before this to understand to this invasion. But if we spend that time here, we'll never get around to the topic we want to talk about. And besides, I'll invite you to come to Yad Vashem and we can discuss it there. Germany invades Poland from the west. Germany, the country, is positioned west of Poland. Germany makes an agreement with the Soviet Union in the background, a hidden agreement. It's called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, so that when Germany invades Poland, Soviet Union won't object. They are sitting to the east. And about 2 weeks after the German invasion, Union also invades from the east, and Poland is overrun in approximately a month. So again, just a little bit of background, because it's important to understand this if we're talking about my parents' experiences. And you can see on this slide, if you look on this slide, can you see my mouse, everybody? Moving around? Yes, okay. So here is Germany, here is the Soviet Union, and here in this map is Poland. And Poland is divided into 3 parts. A part that is annexed by Germany and made part of Germany. A part that is annexed by the Soviet Union, made part of the Soviet Union. Remember, they both invaded from different sides. And there's a section in the center called the general government. The general government is actually controlled completely by Germany, just not made part of Germany. Now, what I have highlighted in red are the locations that we're going to begin to talk about. The first location, where my mom is from, Ida. Ida is from a town, a village, a shtetl, let's say, called Krasnoshelsk. It's right here at the tip of Poland, just north of Warsaw, just under what is part of Germany here. So when the Germans invade, they get there rapidly. My father, on the other hand, is from way eastern side of Poland, very close to the Soviet Union, to the Ukraine. In fact, this area today is part of the Ukraine. If you want to go to Sarny, you have to go to the Ukraine and come across. And it is overrun much later. And we'll get to that because Germany subsequently invades the Soviet Union. I'd like to start my mom's experience. Let's keep it on this. Try to keep it on the screen. Okay. My mom, her maiden name was Bergazin. As I said, she was from a Polish town called Krasnoshelsk, a shtetl. It's a classic shtetl. 3,000 population, about 60% Jewish in 1939. The history goes back even further. The first synagogue was built there in 1883. They had Jews in this village, in this shtetl, already from the 1700s. My mother's family, 5 individuals. My mother herself, her father Shimshon, the spelling is how it was spelled in the Polish time. Her mother Doba, her brother Jack, and her sister Ruthie. My mother was the sandwich child. She was right in the middle.